This is the second lecture in Jesus about Jesus' miracle worker. Sorry for the end of the first lecture. I wasn't paying attention to the clock and lost track. The couple things. First of all, the passage in we were talking about the reaction of the people, the doubting of the people, and that actually that's raising of Jairus' daughter. That is a resuscitation. Anyway, one of the things that we wanted to talk about too was some of the dangerous nature of the disease that the person has. We can see this in the story of miracle takes place in Mark 9, starting at verse 14. Anyway, a fellow comes up to Jesus and asks to have his son healed, to heal his son, or to have his son healed. And in the description of this, we find in verse 18, whenever it seizes him, the demon, the spirit, it dashes him down. He foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And so there's a description there, oftentimes of the seriousness, of the danger almost of the particular, of the person who needs to be healed. Okay. One of the curious things about miracles, so we don't, miracle stories we don't often think about, is more often than not, the actual miracle is really not described, but just not the results. The example I'm mentioning here in my notes is the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and fish. The synoptic gospel authors just tell us that Jesus has made enough of them to feed 5,000, or if it's Luke 4,000. And they don't describe how all of a sudden one fish turns into two and two into four and all these other things. We just have the end result, but not the actual miracle. However, and I've not done a study on this to verify it, but my distinct impression is with the more outstanding miracles like resuscitations, they're actually described. And the healing of the daughter that we just looked at was a good example where he takes her by hand and raises her right up. Boom. And the same thing, similar type of thing goes on with the raising of Lazarus in John, where he calls Lazarus to come forth from the tomb, and Lazarus comes out. He's all wrapped up in bandages and such. So anyway, we don't want to take for granted that the description of the miracle exactly is given to us, but once in a while it is. Now, the healing is communicated in a variety of ways. The two main ones are in touch. We see this in Mark 9:29. Since I'm there, let's see, in verse 27, Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, and he was able to stand. And so it's actually really, that's going to be closer to Mark 9:27. That should be 9:27 right there. In other places, Jesus speaks the word. He says, be healed. And the person is healed. In Mark 5, verse 41, Jesus actually combines touch and word. He took her by the hand, and he said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. Of course, we know from word that he called Lazarus from the tomb by word. There was no touch involved there at all. Okay. Now, one of the things that we find is that, generally speaking, about the miracle story, they don't have a lot of geographical references. And they're few and far between. And this has led many scholars to believe that the gospel authors may have had access to sources that were actually collections of Jesus's miracles. The one study that I know best about this was done by Robert Fortna. It's a small but expensive book because it's published by Leiden and Brill, called The Gospel of Signs. And it's been last time I read this was before you were born. But I still remember very powerfully how well he makes his case that chapters 2 through 12, I think it is, in John's Gospel were built around 7 miracles. They become kind of the foundation, well, the pillars or whatever that hold up those chapters. And he makes a strong case that because of the nature of the descriptions of the miracles and such, that the author, at this point, the author of John's Gospel was using a written source describing those miracles of Jesus. All right, so there's lots of theories about that. I'm just giving you Fortna as one example of that possibility. All right, and this material ought to be a little bit more familiar to Addie, who I've just had it not long ago in New Testament. When we look at Jesus's miracles, there are really 3 main types. And what I'm going to do here is take an example of the of each one of these things and just talk through it a little bit. Mark 5, which I was just there, it's very handy. The healing of the Gerasene or Gadarene demoniac, Mark 5, 1 through 20 in parallels. Literarily, this is an interesting miracle story because you'll see this in Throckmorton. At one point, he lists it as a separate miracle. I think it is for Matthew. And then when you go further on, he lists it as a parallel for Mark and Luke. I think I've got those right. They are very, very similar, but they're apparently, and I've never researched this either, but apparently Throckmorton thought that they were different enough that they really needed to be put in separate listings. But essentially the story is really quite the same. There are some noteworthy differences. Anyway, the first scholar to apply form criticism, form analysis to the Bible was this fellow named Hermann Gunkel. And he did this in the Old Testament. And if you've had Old Testament, you know about this. He was the one who helped us understand the nature of the different literary traditions behind the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah. The first New Testament scholar to apply form analysis to the New Testament was Rudolf Bultmann, who I believe I have mentioned before. If not, he is one of the greats. Also talks about the theology of the New Testament. Fascinating existentialist theologian, and that's another discussion. But if you know, well, anyway, we won't get off on that. But he's very important in the study of the New Testament and his understanding of the different literary forms that we find within the different types of parables, sayings, pronouncement stories. These are things where there's a long story and then Jesus comes out and said there's a big kind of almost like a punchline that Jesus has for the story. Bultmann has done all that work. And there have, of course, been revisions to his theories since, but he's still kind of the foundation for all of this. All right, but in his analysis of the healings or exorcisms, and they are treated the same in the ancient world as we understand them. If somebody was sick, they believed in most cases really that a demon possessed them, or they were very similar. That what we would describe as somebody having a particular seizure, epileptic seizure, they would describe as a demon dwelling in the person. In either case, the persons, I'm not saying these are not true miracles, I'm just saying the way they're understood is a little bit different today and then. Anyway, Bultmann, as he looked at these, he found typical characteristics of these healings or exorcisms. And I just want to highlight a few of these in this story. I'm not going to read the whole story, but just hit some highlights. One of the typical characteristics is that the demon recognizes the person who is exorcising him, the demon. And we see this in verse 7 of Mark 5. when the fellow shouts at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." Okay, and the and this leads really in some ways to there's kind of a struggle between him and Jesus, in the sense that in verse 6, he saw Jesus, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouts at him, saying, "Get away from me, don't torment me." And then Jesus, wins the struggle. He commands the demon to come out of him. Okay, and that, by the way, leads us to the threat and the command from the exorcist. In this case, Jesus, there's no threat, he just does it. He just says, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And the demon departs. And there will be some kind of a making of the demonstration here. There's a discussion between Jesus and the demon, whose name is Legion, and they work out a deal. And Jesus puts the demon or the demons into a herd of pigs, and then they rush down a steep bank into the sea, and they're drowned into the sea. All right. And now, verse 14 of Mark 5, the swineherds ran off and told it in the city and the country. People came to see what it was that had happened. And they saw Jesus, verse 15, saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed in his right mind, and they were afraid. So, there's fear here. Being impressed can take very different forms. Okay, the nature-defying miracles is another major type of miracles, and it's the laws of nature that we're speaking of here. And I don't need to be pulling these the descriptions of these out. I'll just mention them for those of us who don't know them really well. But the miracle, sometimes it's called the miracle of the loaves and fish. King James says fishes. Where Jesus feeds 5,000 or 4,000 people from just a little bit of bread and not much fish at all. And of course, physically, in terms of the laws of nature, that's impossible. You can't do it. So that miracle defies the laws of nature. Probably one of the more outstanding ones is when Jesus crosses across the sea, is walking across the Sea of Galilee in Mark 6, 45 through 52 in the parallels. And of course, biology, but physics also tells us that the molecular density of water is not sufficient to sustain a human body unless it's frozen. And so this is another case where the miracle is he defies the laws of nature. The third major type of miracle are resuscitations. And as I always say in New Testament, we call them this because we don't want to confuse them with God's raising Jesus from the dead. This is something that you need to pay attention to in the New Testament. In our evangelical fervor, sometimes we forget Jesus did not raise himself from the dead. Now, if you believe in the doctrine of the Trinity, then in a sense you could say he does. But the language that's used in the New Testament, which is before the doctrine of the Trinity, is that God raised Jesus from the dead. And so we prefer not to use the word resurrections because that gets a little confusing, and some people will think, well, Jesus' resurrection is an example of that. Well, no, it's not. Not as we're using that term here. And we've looked at the first one of this already, the raising of Jairus' daughter, the raising of Lazarus is classic in John 11. Powerful story, and it's got a lot of emotion in there. And then the third, the widow's son in a town called Nain. Now here's an example where a miracle is actually, there's a geographical reference given in the miracle, which means it may not have come from a written source. Who knows? But anyway, that's in Luke 7. To our knowledge, in the New Testament, these are the only three resuscitations that Jesus performs. All right, that's the end of the second lecture. I'm going to stop here and move on to the third part of Jesus as miracle worker.